Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to my channel. Your support is very important to me, so please subscribe to follow more cases and encourage us. Click the like button and let's get into the case. Ray Donovan squinted against the harsh glare of sunlight reflecting off the Gulf of Mexico. At 50 years old, his weathered face had accumulated more wrinkles than he cared to count, each one a testament to countless days spent on the water. His blue eyes, still sharp despite the crow's feet at their corners, scanned the horizon where water met sky in a seamless azure line. The gentle rocking of his boat, the Marlin Hunter, had long ago become as natural to him as the solid ground was to most people. "This is the spot," he muttered to himself, checking the coordinates on his GPS one more time. He was about 30 miles southwest of Key West, Florida, in waters he knew were frequented by yellowfin tuna this time of year. The August heat was relentless, beating down on his already bronzed skin despite the early hour. Ray wiped sweat from his brow with a faded bandana he kept in the pocket of his fishing vest. The previous night he'd received a call from his longtime fishing buddy Mike Sanchez, who had to cancel their planned 2-day excursion due to a family emergency. Ray had considered postponing the trip, but ultimately decided against it. The weather forecast was perfect, calm seas and clear skies, and his freezer at home was nearly empty. Besides, he had been making solo fishing trips since he was 18, and the Marlin Hunter, a 28-foot center console, was more than manageable for one experienced fisherman. "Let's see what we can find today," he said aloud, a habit he'd developed over years of solitary fishing trips. Ray checked his watch, 6:15 a.m. The prime hours for yellowfin were just beginning. He reduced the boat's speed as he approached the coordinates he'd marked from his last successful trip to this area about 3 weeks prior. The depth finder showed 120 feet of water beneath him, and the surface temperature gauge read 82 degrees. Perfect conditions. Ray cut the engine and allowed the boat to drift naturally with the gentle current. The sudden silence was broken only by the soft lapping of water against the hull and the distant cry of seagulls. He moved to the stern where his gear was neatly arranged and began preparing his lines. Today he was using a spread of artificial lures, primarily blue and white skirts that resembled squid, the yellowfin's preferred prey in these waters. As he worked, his mind wandered to the previous evening's phone call with his daughter, Emily. At 27, she was building her own life in Atlanta, working as a physical therapist and recently engaged to her boyfriend of 3 years. The distance between them sometimes weighed heavily on Ray, especially since his divorce from Carol 5 years ago. These solo fishing trips had become more than just a means to catch fish. They were his therapy, his way of processing the changes in his life. "She's doing fine without you hovering, old man," he reminded himself with a small smile. Emily had promised to visit in a few weeks to discuss wedding plans, and the thought brightened his mood as he finished rigging his 5th and final line. With practiced efficiency, Ray deployed each line at varying distances behind the boat. He set the drags on his reels carefully, tight enough to set the hook when a fish struck, but loose enough to prevent the line from breaking under the powerful runs tuna were known for. With all 5 lines trailing behind the drifting boat, he settled into the fighting chair, bolted to the deck, and poured himself a cup of coffee from his thermos. The next 2 hours passed uneventfully. Ray reeled in his lines twice to check that the lures were still clean and functioning properly, then reset them. He was considering moving to a different location when the rod furthest to his right suddenly bent double, its tip nearly touching the water. "There we go," he exclaimed, jumping from the chair and grabbing the rod from its holder. The reel's drag screamed as line peeled off at an alarming rate. Whatever had taken his lure was big and moving fast. Ray braced himself against the gunnel, adjusting his stance to compensate for the boat's motion. Come on," he muttered, feeling the raw power of the fish through the rod. After the initial run slowed, he began the methodical process of gaining line, pumping the rod up and then reeling down quickly as he lowered it. Inch by inch he recovered line, sweat now pouring freely down his face and back. 20 minutes into the fight, Ray caught his first glimpse of the fish, a flash of silver and blue beneath the surface. "Yellowfin," he confirmed to himself, noting the distinctive sickle-shaped yellow finlets along its back, and it was a big one, probably over 100 pounds. As the fish made another powerful run, Ray noticed movement in the water about 50 yards behind the boat. A triangular fin briefly broke the surface before disappearing again. His heart rate quickened, not from exertion now, but from a primal surge of caution. "Shark," he whispered. It wasn't uncommon in these waters. Sharks often followed boats, attracted by the sounds of struggling fish and the scent of fish blood in the water. From the brief glimpse, Ray guessed it was an oceanic white-tip, a species known to be curious and potentially aggressive. He'd have to work faster to land the tuna before the shark decided to claim it for itself. The next 10 minutes were an intense battle of wills. The tuna's runs became shorter, its resistance weakening. Ray could now see it clearly, a magnificent yellowfin, possibly 120 pounds or more, the largest he'd caught in years. But his peripheral vision also caught more movement. The shark was circling closer, its distinctive white-tipped fins occasionally visible. "Not today," Ray grunted, determined to land his prize before the shark could take it. He increased the pressure on the fish, pushing his gear to its limits. The tuna was now just 20 feet from the boat, its silver sides flashing in the sunlight as it made desperate short circles. Ray reached for his gaff hook, a tool designed to help land large fish. He needed to time this perfectly. One solid strike behind the tuna's head would secure it. With the rod balanced precariously between his arm and body, he leaned over the gunnel, gaff extended. What happened next occurred so quickly that Ray's brain barely registered the sequence of events. As he stretched further over the side, his foot slipped on a small puddle of water on the deck. His center of gravity shifted suddenly, and before he could catch himself, he was falling. There was a moment of weightlessness, a splash, and then the shocking embrace of the Gulf's warm waters. Instinctively, Ray closed his mouth to prevent swallowing seawater as he plunged beneath the surface. His eyes stung from the salt water, but he forced them open, orienting himself toward the light filtering from above. With powerful kicks, he propelled himself upward, breaking the surface with a gasp. "Damn it!" he shouted, treading water and looking up at his boat, now drifting slowly away from him. The rod he'd been holding was gone, likely sinking to the bottom with the tuna still attached. His first thought was to swim after the boat, but a flash of movement in the water nearby froze him in place. The oceanic white-tip shark, initially attracted by the struggling tuna, had now detected a new disturbance. Ray knew enough about shark behavior to understand his situation had just become precarious. Oceanic whitetips were known for their persistence and opportunistic feeding habits. While not as notorious as great whites, they were responsible for numerous attacks on shipwreck survivors throughout history. Ray forced himself to remain as still as possible while treading water, knowing that excessive splashing might trigger the shark's predatory instincts. His boat was drifting further away with each passing second, now about 30 yards distant. He needed to swim for it, but the shark's proximity made that a dangerous proposition. Taking slow, deliberate breaths to calm his racing heart, Ray assessed his options. The shark was circling about 15 yards away, its movements unhurried but purposeful. Its pale gray body, probably 9 feet long, would occasionally disappear from view, only to reappear from a different direction. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself. "Make a plan and stick to it." Ray knew that his boat would continue to drift with the current, and swimming directly after it might only extend the time he spent in the water. Instead, he decided to swim at an angle, attempting to intercept the boat's path, while keeping his movements smooth and deliberate to avoid exciting the shark. Keeping his eyes on both the circling predator and his destination, Ray began to swim, using a modified breaststroke that kept his limbs close to his body rather than extending them outward. Each movement was measured, each breath controlled. Despite his efforts to remain calm, his mind raced with stories he'd heard throughout his fishing career. Accounts of oceanic whitetips' persistence and aggression. He'd covered perhaps 10 yards when the shark's behavior changed. It began swimming in tighter circles, its movements becoming more erratic. Ray knew enough about shark behavior to recognize these as potential pre-attack indicators. His heart hammered against his ribs as adrenaline flooded his system. The shark disappeared from view for several seconds, a worrying development. Ray scanned the water around him, fighting the urge to thrash in panic. The predator could approach from any direction, including below. The attack, when it came, was preceded by only the slightest pressure wave in the water. Ray felt something brush against his leg, and then pain exploded across his right calf. The shark had made an exploratory bite, a behavior common in many species, as they determine whether an unfamiliar object is prey. Ray couldn't suppress a shout of pain and shock. He kicked instinctively, his foot connecting with something rough, the shark's skin. The contact seemed to startle the predator, which released its grip and moved away temporarily. Blood clouded the water around Ray's leg, and he knew this would only increase the shark's interest. The boat was still 20 yards away, too far to reach before the shark returned, especially with his injured leg. Pain throbbed through his calf with each heartbeat, but adrenaline helped him push it aside for the moment. The shark reappeared, now swimming with more purpose, its powerful body cutting through the water with frightening efficiency. Ray remembered advice from a marine biologist he'd once taken fishing. If attacked, fight back. Sharks often abandon attacks if their prey proves too difficult or dangerous. As the oceanic whitetip approached for a second pass, Ray prepared himself. When the shark was within reach, he struck out with as much force as he could muster, aiming for its sensitive snout and gills. His fist connected with the rough skin just behind the shark's eye, and the creature veered away momentarily. Taking advantage of this brief reprieve, Ray began swimming toward his boat with renewed urgency, no longer concerned about making smooth, non-threatening movements. Pain shot through his injured leg with each kick, but the alternative to reaching the boat had become unthinkable. The shark returned quickly, emboldened rather than deterred by Ray's resistance. This time it approached from below, invisible until the last moment. Ray felt a tremendous force close around his right thigh, teeth penetrating flesh and muscle with horrifying ease. The pain was beyond anything he had ever experienced, white-hot and all-consuming. Water churned around him as the shark shook its head, the motion designed to tear flesh from bone. Ray screamed, the sound seeming distant and unreal to his own ears. With his left hand he reached down and gouged at the shark's eye, driving his thumb into the soft organ with desperate strength. The shark released him abruptly and veered away. The water around Ray was now darkly clouded with his blood. His right leg felt oddly disconnected, responding sluggishly to his commands. Through the haze of pain and fear, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity. He would die here if he didn't reach the boat immediately. His boat had drifted in a semicircle due to the wind and current, and was now about 15 yards away. Ray's vision began to narrow, dark edges encroaching on his periphery, the beginning of shock. Fighting against the encroaching darkness, he used his arms and left leg to propel himself toward the boat, each movement an exercise in agony. The shark circled at a distance, perhaps temporarily deterred by Ray's resistance, but still interested in the blood scent permeating the water. Ray knew it would attack again soon. Oceanic whitetips were known for their persistence. 10 yards to the boat. Ray's movements became less coordinated as blood loss weakened him. 7 yards. His injured leg was now little more than dead weight trailing behind him. 5 yards. The shark began closing in again, its pattern of approach recognizable now, tightening circles, erratic movements. With a final surge of desperate strength, Ray reached the side of the marlin hunter. His bloody hands slipped on the smooth fiberglass as he tried to pull himself up. Panic threatened to overwhelm him as he realized he might not have the strength to board. The shark was approaching again, now just yards away. In a last desperate attempt, Ray grabbed the metal cleat used for tying dock lines and pulled with everything he had left. Somehow, he managed to raise his upper body over the gunwale, then rolled his torso onto the deck. His injured leg remained dangling in the water for one terrifying moment before he could drag it aboard. As he collapsed onto the deck, Ray heard a solid thump against the hull, the shark striking at where he had been seconds before. He lay, breathing in ragged gasps, his vision swimming in and out of focus. Blood pooled beneath his mangled leg, spreading across the white deck in an ever-widening circle. With trembling hands, Ray reached for his cell phone in his pocket, but found only sodden fabric. The phone was gone, likely lost during his struggle in the water. The marine radio mounted at the helm was his next hope. If he could reach it, he could call the Coast Guard for help. The distance from where he lay to the helm seemed insurmountable. Every movement sent waves of agony through his body. Ray tore off his shirt and with fumbling fingers created a makeshift tourniquet for his thigh. The pressure increased the pain momentarily, but stemmed some of the bleeding. "Move," he commanded himself aloud, his voice weak and unfamiliar to his own ears. "You have to move." Using his elbows and left leg, Ray began the excruciating process of dragging himself across the deck. Blood made the surface slick, paradoxically helping him slide but also making it difficult to gain purchase. The few yards to the helm became a journey measured in inches and agonizing minutes. When he finally reached the console, Ray pulled himself up enough to access the radio. His vision blurred as he fumbled with the controls, finally managing to set it to channel 16, the international distress frequency. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday," he gasped into the microphone, protocol somehow surfacing through the fog of pain and shock. "This is fishing vessel Marlin Hunter, approximately 30 miles southwest of Key West. I've been attacked by a shark and am severely injured. Request immediate assistance." He repeated the call twice more, as required by protocol, then waited, fighting to stay conscious. The response, when it came, was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. "Vessel calling Mayday, this is United States Coast Guard Key West. We have received your distress call. Please provide details of your situation and position if known." With faltering words, Ray explained what had happened and provided his GPS coordinates from the display in front of him. The Coast Guard operator assured him that help was on the way and instructed him to apply pressure to his wounds and remain on the radio. "Estimated time of arrival is 45 minutes, the operator informed him. "Is there anyone else aboard who can assist you?" "No," Ray replied, his voice barely audible now. "I'm alone." "Sir, I need you to stay awake and continue talking to me. Can you do that?" Ray mumbled an affirmative, though staying conscious was becoming increasingly difficult. The operator began asking him questions, his full name, age, medical conditions, anything to keep him engaged and alert. Through the fog of his fading awareness, Ray noticed something odd. The shark was still circling the boat, its fin occasionally visible above the surface. In all his years of fishing, he'd never seen such persistent behavior. Most sharks lost interest once their intended prey escaped, but this oceanic white tip seemed fixated on the boat and the blood trail in the water. "The shark," he murmured into the radio. "It's still here." "Sir, what about the shark?" the operator asked, concern evident in his voice. "It's circling the boat," Ray replied, his words slurring slightly. "Never seen one do that before." "Mr. Donovan, focus on your injuries right now. Help is on the way. Can you tighten your tourniquet? Ray fumbled with the twisted shirt around his thigh, pulling it tighter with a groan. The bleeding had slowed, but the damage was severe. Through the haze of pain, he could see that the shark's teeth had torn through muscle and possibly nicked the femoral artery. His lower leg bore a deep laceration from the first bite, exposing white glimpses of bone. Time became fluid, stretching and contracting unpredictably as Ray drifted in and out of consciousness. The Coast Guard operator's voice seemed to come from increasingly far away, despite his efforts to respond. At some point, he became aware of a rhythmic thumping sound that wasn't coming from the radio. It took his pain-addled brain several moments to recognize the sound of helicopter rotors. Summoning his remaining strength, Ray raised his head enough to see a Coast Guard MH-65 Dolphin helicopter hovering above the Marlin Hunter. A rescue swimmer was being lowered from the aircraft, descending on a cable toward the boat. The swimmer, clad in an orange rescue suit, landed on the deck with practiced precision. His face, partially obscured by a helmet and visor, showed professional, calm as he quickly assessed Ray's condition. "Mr. Donovan, I'm Petty Officer Martinez with the Coast Guard. We're going to get you out of here," he said, his trained eyes already examining the injuries. "I need to stabilize you before transport." Ray tried to respond but found he couldn't form words anymore. The rescue swimmer didn't waste time on further conversation. With efficient movements, he replaced Ray's makeshift tourniquet with a proper one from his medical kit, then quickly inserted an IV line into Ray's arm. Severe blood loss, multiple. "Shark bites to right leg. Patient semi-conscious," Martinez reported into his helmet microphone. "Need immediate evacuation." As the rescue swimmer worked, Ray noticed him glancing occasionally at the water around the boat. Following his gaze, Ray saw that the oceanic white tip was still circling, its fin slicing through the surface with methodical patience. "That's not normal behavior," Martinez commented, noticing Ray's awareness of the shark. "Usually they don't fixate like this." Through his haze of pain, Ray remembered old fishermen's tales about certain sharks developing a taste for human flesh. He'd always dismissed such stories as superstition, but facing the persistent predator circling his boat, those tales suddenly seemed less fanciful. Martinez secured Ray to a rescue basket that had been lowered from the helicopter. "We're going to hoist you up now," he explained. "The motion might increase the pain temporarily, but we need to get you to medical care as quickly as possible." As the basket began to rise, Ray's fading consciousness registered the sensation of leaving the familiar environment of his boat. The marlin hunter grew smaller below him, the white deck stained with his blood. Hands still visible in the crystal-clear Gulf waters, the oceanic whitetip continued its circular patrol, a pale shadow beneath the surface. The world faded to black as Ray was pulled into the helicopter. His last conscious thought was of Emily. Would he live to see her wedding? Consciousness returned to Ray in fragments, beeping machines, hushed voices, the antiseptic smell of hospital surroundings. When he finally managed to open his eyes, the harsh fluorescent lighting caused him to wince and turn away. "Dad, are you awake?" The voice was familiar and beloved. Emily. Ray turned back toward the sound, his vision gradually focusing on his daughter's face. Her brown eyes, so like his own, were rimmed with red from crying, but she was smiling now. "Em," he croaked, his throat painfully dry. "You're here." "Of course I'm here," she replied, reaching for his hand. "They called me yesterday after your surgery. I took the first flight I could get." Surgery. The word triggered a flood of memories. Falling overboard, the shark's attack, the rescue. Ray tried to sit up but was prevented by both weakness and Emily's gentle, restraining hand. "Easy, Dad. You lost a lot of blood. The doctors had to work hard to save your leg." Ray lifted the thin hospital blanket with a trembling hand. His right leg was heavily bandaged from thigh to ankle, elevated on pillows. Tubes and wires connected him to various machines, monitoring his vital signs. Is it still? He couldn't quite form the question. Emily understood. "They saved it. It was close. The femoral artery was damaged, and you lost a dangerous amount of blood. But yes, the leg is still there. The doctor said you'll need extensive rehabilitation, though." Relief washed over Ray, followed quickly by a wave of gratitude toward the medical team and the Coast Guard personnel who had rescued him. "How long have I been here?" "About 30 hours, Emily replied. "They kept you sedated after surgery because of the pain. You're in Jackson Memorial in Miami. They airlifted you here because they have one of the best trauma centers in Florida." Amigo. Doctor entered the room, clipboard in hand. She was a woman in her mid-40s with short black hair and a confident demeanor. "Mr. Donovan, good to see you're with us. I'm Dr. Patel, the vascular surgeon who worked on your leg." After checking his vital signs and examining the bandaged wounds, Dr. Patel explained the extent of his injuries and the procedures they'd performed. "The bites caused significant damage to the muscles in your calf and thigh. We've repaired the femoral artery and done our best to reconstruct the damaged tissue, but you're facing a long recovery period." "Will I walk again?" Ray asked, the question that had been foremost in his mind. Dr. Patel's expression was carefully neutral. "With successful physical therapy, yes, you should regain the ability to walk. However, I need to be honest with you. There may be permanent limitations. The nerve damage was extensive, particularly in your lower leg." The news hit Ray hard, but he nodded stoically. Walking with limitations was better than the alternative he'd feared. "You're incredibly fortunate." "Mr. Donovan," Dr. Patel continued, "if the Coast Guard hadn't reached you when they did, or if the shark's teeth had severed the femoral artery completely rather than just damaging it, we wouldn't be having this conversation." After the doctor left, Emily pulled her chair closer to the bed. "What happened out there, Dad? The Coast Guard report said you fell overboard while fishing." Ray began recounting the events, the tuna strike, his fall, the shark's persistent attacks. Emily listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from horror to relief as the story progressed. "The boat," Ray said, suddenly remembering. "What happened to the marlin hunter?" "The Coast Guard secured it after they rescued you," Emily assured him. "Mike went out with them yesterday to bring it back to the marina. He said there was a lot of blood to clean up, but otherwise the boat is fine." Ray nodded, grateful for his friend's assistance. "And my gear?" Emily gave him a look that was part exasperation, part affection. "Trust you to worry about your fishing rods after nearly being eaten by a shark." Mike said most of it was still there, though one rod was missing, probably the one you were holding when you fell. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of two men in Coast Guard uniforms. They introduced themselves as Lieutenant Commander Wilson and Petty Officer Grayson from the Key West station. "We wanted to check on your condition, Mr. Donovan," Wilson explained, "and to get a complete statement about the incident for our records." Ray repeated his account of the events, this time with more attention to detail. The exact location, the shark's behavior both before and after the attack, and the sequence of events leading to his rescue. "The persistence of the shark is unusual," Grayson noted, jotting details in a small notebook. "Oceanic whitetips can be aggressive, but they typically don't fixate on a boat that way after losing access to their prey." "That's what the rescue swimmer said," Ray agreed. "In all my years fishing those waters, I've never seen behavior quite like it." Wilson cleared his throat. "We've issued a navigational warning for vessels in that area to be on alert for aggressive shark activity. We'll also be notifying the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. They might want to investigate further." After taking his full statement, the Coast Guard officers wished him a speedy recovery and departed, leaving Ray alone with Emily again. "You could have died," she said quietly, once the door had closed behind them. "If your phone hadn't been lost, would you have called me before calling for help?" The question caught Ray off guard. I don't know, Em. It all happened so fast." "Promise me you won't go out alone anymore," she insisted, her eyes filling with tears. "At least take Mike or someone else with you, please." Ray wanted to protest, to assert his independence and lifetime of experience on the water, but the fear in his daughter's eyes stopped him. "I promise," he said instead, squeezing her hand. "No more solo trips." The next few days passed in a blur of medical examinations, pain management, and visits from friends. Mike Sanchez came by, bringing news from the marina and updates about the marlin hunter, which he had thoroughly cleaned and secured at Ray's dock. "Word's getting around about your encounter," Mike informed him. "Some of the charter captains are already telling tourists your story, with considerable embellishment, I might add. According to Bobby Jenkins, you fought the shark with your bare hands for 30 minutes before the Coast Guard arrived." Ray snorted. "More like 30 seconds, and I was mostly trying not to pass out from blood loss." "Makes for a better story the other way," Mike grinned. His expression turned more serious. "The FWC sent a biologist to talk to me yesterday. She's interested in the shark's behavior. Apparently they're tracking reports of an unusually aggressive oceanic whitetip in that area." "What do you mean, tracking reports?" Ray asked. "Have there been other incidents?" Mike shrugged. "She didn't give specifics, but she implied yours wasn't the first unusual encounter. Mostly attacks on fish being reeled in, much closer to boats than normal. They're calling it a bold individual." The word choice seemed oddly understated to Ray. Bold didn't begin to describe the calculated persistence he'd witnessed. On the 4th day after the attack, Ray received another visitor, Dr. Melanie Chen from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. She was a marine biologist specializing in shark behavior and had come to get Ray's first-hand account of the encounter. "Mr. Donovan, your experience is particularly valuable because you have decades of experience on the water," Dr. Chen explained after introducing herself. "You can distinguish between typical and atypical shark behavior better than most victims of attacks." Ray described the incident again, focusing on the shark's actions both before and after the attack. Dr. Chen listened intently, occasionally making notes on her tablet. "The persistent circling of your vessel after you were no longer in the water is especially interesting," she commented. "Oceanic whitetips are known for their curiosity and boldness, but this level of focused attention is unusual. It seemed almost," Ray hesitated, searching for the right word, "deliberate, like it was waiting for another opportunity." Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "There's growing evidence that some shark individuals can develop specialized hunting strategies or preferences. We typically think of this in terms of prey selection, certain great whites that specialize in seals, for instance. But there are rare documented cases of individual sharks that seem to repeatedly target human swimmers or divers in a specific area." "You think this could be one of those?" Ray asked, remembering the single-minded focus in the shark's movements. "It's a possibility we're investigating," she replied carefully. "We've had reports from several fishing vessels in that same area describing unusually bold behavior from what's likely an oceanic whitetip, primarily approaching very close to boats and taking hooked fish. But your case represents an escalation if it's the same individual." "What happens now?" Ray asked. "Will you try to catch it?" Dr. Chen's expression turned guarded. The FWC doesn't typically remove sharks from their natural habitat based on a single incident or even a pattern of bold behavior. These are apex predators fulfilling their ecological role. However, we will continue monitoring the situation and gathering data. Ray understood the scientific perspective, but having felt the creature's teeth tear through his flesh, he found it difficult to share the biologist's detachment. Still, he appreciated her professional interest in his experience. If you think of any additional details about the shark, distinctive markings, exact size, any unusual features, please contact me, Dr. Chen said, handing him her card before departing. That evening, as Ray was attempting to eat the unappetizing hospital dinner, a local news reporter somehow managed to gain access to his room despite the hospital's screening of visitors. "Mr. Donovan, I'm Jason Myers from Channel 7 News," the young man said, producing a small recorder. "We'd like to get your story for our evening broadcast. Shark attacks make compelling news, especially with summer tourism in full swing." Ray frowned, annoyed by the intrusion and the reporter's transparent excitement about the compelling news of his trauma. "I'm not interested in being on the news," the reporter persisted. "The public has a right to know about dangerous sharks in local waters. Your story could potentially save lives by alerting others to the danger. Or it could create unnecessary panic and harm shark conservation efforts," Ray countered, thinking of Dr. Chen's careful approach to the situation. "I've told my story to the Coast Guard and the FWC. They're handling it appropriately." Despite further attempts to persuade him, Ray remained firm in his refusal. Eventually, a nurse noticed the unauthorized visitor and had security escort the reporter from the building. The incident left Ray contemplating the potential public reaction to his experience. Shark attacks invariably generated sensationalist headlines and calls for action against the perceived threat, regardless of how rare such attacks actually were. He had no desire to contribute to the demonization of a species that was simply behaving according to its nature, even if that nature had nearly cost him his life. On the 7th day after the attack, Ray was discharged from the hospital with prescriptions for pain management, antibiotics to prevent infection, and referrals for physical therapy. Emily had extended her stay in Florida to help him settle back at home, temporarily moving into his guest room. Ray's modest single-story house in a quiet Key West neighborhood had never felt so welcoming. With Emily's help, he settled into a recliner in the living room, his bandaged leg elevated on cushions. "Home sweet home," he sighed, looking around at the familiar surroundings. Photos of fishing trips on the walls, nautical-themed decorations that Carol had chosen years ago and that he'd never bothered to replace after the divorce. Emily busied, herself arranging his medications on the kitchen counter and preparing a more substantial meal than hospital fare. "The physical therapist will come here for the first few sessions," she informed him, "until you're mobile enough to go to the clinic." Ray nodded, already dreading the painful process of rehabilitation that lay ahead. His career as a fishing guide, already semi-retired but still an important part of his identity and income, would be on hold indefinitely. At 50, with these injuries, he wondered if he would ever fully return to the active life he'd known. The next morning, Mike arrived with coffee and news from the marina. "The FWC biologist has been interviewing everyone who fishes that area," he reported. "Sounds like they're taking this more seriously than they initially let on." "What are people saying?" Ray asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Mixed reports. Some have noticed unusually bold behavior from sharks in that area over the past few months. Others haven't seen anything out of the ordinary." Mike hesitated before continuing. "There was another incident yesterday, though, about 20 miles from where you were attacked." Ray felt a chill despite the warm morning. "What happened?" Charter boat had a client hooked up to a big amberjack. As they were reeling it in, a shark rushed the boat, came right up to the gunwale and took the fish. The captain swears it was an oceanic white-tip, about the same size as the one that got you. "Anyone hurt?" Mike shook his head. "No, but the captain said it was the most aggressive approach he's seen in 20 years of running charters. The shark didn't just take the fish. It hung around afterwards, circling the boat for almost 10 minutes. Ray frowned, remembering Dr. Chen's carefully neutral comments about bold individuals and specialized hunting strategies. If this was indeed the same shark, it was developing a pattern of behavior centered around fishing vessels. "Has the FWC issued any warnings?" he asked. "Nothing official." "Yet," Mike replied. Just asking captains to report any unusual shark encounters. I think they're trying to avoid causing alarm among tourists. The following weeks settled into a routine of pain management, physical therapy, and gradual adaptation to his temporary limitations. Emily eventually had to return to Atlanta, but not before setting up a schedule of friends and neighbors to check on Ray regularly. Mike visited almost daily, keeping him connected to the fishing community and the water he missed so desperately. Ray's physical therapist, a former military medic named Derek, pushed him relentlessly during their sessions. The pain was often excruciating, but Ray gritted his teeth and followed the demanding regimen. His progress was slow but steady, first standing with support, then taking tentative steps with a walker, eventually graduating to a cane for short distances around the house. 6 weeks after the attack, Ray received a call from Dr. Chen at the FWC. "Mr. Donovan, we've been monitoring shark activity in the area of your incident," she began without preamble. "There have been several more reports of unusually aggressive behavior, all consistent with an oceanic white tip of similar size to the one you described." "I heard about another incident the day after I got home," Ray replied. "Has there been more?" 3 more documented close approaches to fishing vessels, and 1 case where a shark actually bumped a small boat repeatedly, Dr. Chen confirmed. "No further attacks on people, fortunately, but the behavior pattern is concerning enough that we've decided to attempt to tag the individual if possible." "Tag it?" Ray questioned. "Not remove it?" There was a slight pause before Dr. Chen answered. "We prefer non-lethal management whenever possible. If we can identify and track this individual, we'll gain valuable data on its movements and behavior patterns. That information could help us develop better guidance for fishermen in the area." Ray understood the scientific rationale, but couldn't help feeling that a more permanent solution might be warranted. Still, it wasn't his decision to make. "How will you identify the right shark? There must be many oceanic white tips in the Gulf." "We're looking for distinctive markings," Dr. Chen explained. "When you encountered the shark, did you notice any unusual scars, coloration patterns, or other identifying features?" Ray closed his eyes, trying to recall details from those terrifying moments in the water. It was larger than average for the species, at least 9 feet. The white tips on the fins were very pronounced. He paused, searching his memory. "Wait, there was something else. When it circled close to the boat after I got out of the water, I noticed it had a strange mark on its right side, just behind the gill slits. Almost looked like a crescent moon shape, lighter than the surrounding skin." "A scar or natural marking?" Dr. Chen asked, her voice betraying increased interest. "Probably a scar," Ray replied. "Too defined to be natural, I think." "That's extremely helpful," she said. "We'll include that in our identification parameters." After ending the call, Ray sat for a long time, staring out the window toward the water visible in the distance. The shark that had nearly killed him was still out there, potentially becoming more dangerous with each successful interaction with fishing vessels. The thought was unsettling, especially as his own return to the water drew closer with his ongoing recovery. 2 months after the attack, Ray visited the marina for the first time since the incident. Leaning heavily on his cane, he made his way slowly down the dock to where the Marlin Hunter was moored. Mike walked beside him, ready to offer support if needed. The boat looked immaculate. Mike had been maintaining it meticulously during Ray's recovery. Standing beside it now, Ray was assaulted by vivid flashbacks of dragging his bleeding body across the deck, the shark's persistent circling, the Coast Guard rescue. "You okay?" Mike asked, noticing his tension. "Yeah," Ray replied, forcing himself to take a deep breath. "Just remembering. You don't have to go out today if you're not ready," Mike reminded him. "We can just sit on the dock, have a beer, go home." Ray shook his head. "I need to do this. If I wait until I feel completely ready, I might never go back out there." With Mike's help, Ray carefully boarded the Marlin Hunter. Standing on the deck where he'd nearly bled to death brought a fresh wave of anxiety, but he pushed through it, moving deliberately to the helm. "Just a short trip," Mike said, untying the dock lines. "Around the harbor and back, okay?" Ray nodded, his hands slightly trembling as he started the engines. The familiar rumble beneath his feet was simultaneously comforting and threatening, a reminder of both his lifelong connection to the water and the near-fatal incident that had occurred on this very vessel. They cruised slowly through the harbor, Ray gradually relaxing as muscle memory took over. By the time they returned to the dock an hour later, some of his confidence had returned, though he knew it would be months before he felt truly comfortable on the water again, if ever. Over the next few weeks, Ray ventured out with Mike for increasingly longer trips, always staying within sight of land and in areas populated by other boats. His physical recovery continued to progress, the cane eventually becoming unnecessary for short distances, though he still walked with a pronounced limp and experienced chronic pain in his right leg. 3 months after the attack, Ray received another call from Dr. Chen. "Mr. Donovan, I wanted to update you on our research. We believe we've identified the shark involved in your incident." Ray sat up straighter in his chair. "You found it?" "One of our research vessels encountered an oceanic white tip, matching your description, including the crescent-shaped scar," she confirmed. "We successfully attached a satellite tag that will allow us to track its movements." "Where was it when you found it?" Ray asked. "About 15 miles from the location of your attack, still in the same general area. Preliminary data from the tag suggests it has a relatively defined territory it patrols, which is somewhat unusual for the species. They're typically more wide-ranging." Ray absorbed this information with mixed emotions. There was a strange satisfaction in knowing the specific animal that had attacked him had been identified, yet also discomfort in the confirmation that it remained in the same waters he hoped to return to eventually. "Has its behavior been consistent with what you expected?" he asked. Dr. Chen hesitated briefly. "It's shown continued interest in fishing vessels within its range. We've observed it approaching boats more directly than is typical for the species. The tracking data will help us determine if there are patterns to these approaches or if they're random encounters." "And you're still not considering removing it?" Ray couldn't help asking. "That remains a last resort," Dr. Chen replied diplomatically. "We prefer to understand the behavior first. This is an opportunity to study how certain sharks may develop specialized strategies around human activities. That knowledge could help prevent future incidents." After ending the call, Ray sat on his porch, watching the sunset over distant water. The knowledge that his attacker had been identified and tagged should have brought some closure, but instead it left him with a lingering unease. The shark was still out there, still approaching fishing vessels, potentially becoming more habituated to human presence with each encounter. 6 months after the attack, Ray had progressed enough in his recovery to consider returning to limited work as a fishing guide. His first clients were old friends, a father and son from Michigan who had fished with him annually for years. They were understanding of his limitations and patient with the slower pace necessitated by his injury. As Ray steered the marlin hunter toward a familiar fishing spot about 10 miles offshore, closer to land than his pre-attack excursions, he found himself constantly scanning the water for fins. Mike had accompanied him as a precaution for this first guided trip, providing an extra pair of hands and eyes. "Weather couldn't be better," Mike commented, noting Ray's tension and trying to distract him. "Should be perfect for yellowtail." Ray nodded, forcing himself to focus on the practical aspects of the trip, rather than the lingering fear that shadowed his return to deeper water. They reached the fishing spot without incident and set up a chum slick to attract the yellowtail snapper they were targeting. The clients were soon happily reeling in fish, their excitement a reminder of why Ray had loved this work for so many years. For brief periods, he almost forgot his anxiety, lost in the familiar rhythm of baiting hooks, offering advice, and celebrating successful catches. The incident occurred without warning during their 3rd hour on the water. One of the clients had just hooked a sizable yellowtail when a shadow materialized beneath the surface nearby. Before anyone could react, a shark lunged upward, seizing the hooked fish and severing the line in a violent splash. "Whoa!" the client exclaimed, more excited than alarmed. "Did you see that? Must have been a 5-footer at least." Ray had seen it, a bull shark, not an oceanic white tip, and a relatively common occurrence in these waters. Yet the brief encounter left him shaking, cold sweat beading on his forehead as unwelcome memories flooded back. He gripped the gunnel to steady himself, hoping the clients wouldn't notice his reaction. Mike saw his distress and smoothly took over, rebaiting the client's hook while engaging him in conversation about the shark. Ray moved to the helm, ostensibly to check their position, but actually to have a moment to compose himself. "You okay?" Mike asked quietly when he could step away from the clients. "Yeah," Ray replied, though his pale face suggested otherwise. "Just caught me off guard." They finished the trip without further shark encounters, and the clients departed. satisfied with their catch, apparently oblivious to Ray's momentary panic. Once they were gone, Ray slumped into the fighting chair, emotionally exhausted. "It's going to take time," Mike said sympathetically. "Nobody expects you to just get over something like that." Ray nodded, grateful for his friend's understanding but frustrated by his own reaction. The bull shark had shown perfectly normal behavior for its species, opportunistically taking an easy meal, yet it had triggered an intense fear response completely disproportionate to the actual threat. "I can't work like this," he said finally. "Not if I'm going to panic every time a shark shows up. It happens too often in these waters." "First trip back is the hardest," Mike assured him. "It'll get easier." Ray wasn't convinced, but he knew he had to keep trying. His identity and livelihood were too intertwined with the water to simply walk away, despite the trauma he'd experienced. Over the next few weeks, Ray continued taking clients out, each trip becoming marginally easier than the last. He still experienced anxiety when sharks appeared, but the episodes became less debilitating with repeated exposure. He found himself developing new habits, positioning the boat to maintain better awareness of the surrounding water, keeping a dedicated shark spotter when clients were focused on fishing, and always carrying a shark deterrent device attached to his belt. 8 months after the attack, Ray received a final update from Dr. Chen at the FWC. "The oceanic white-tip we tagged has left the area," she informed him. "The satellite tracking shows it moved into deeper Atlantic waters about 6 weeks ago and hasn't returned to the coastal region since." "Why would it leave after apparently establishing a territory there?" Ray asked, surprised by this development. "We can only speculate," Dr. Chen replied. "Oceanic white-tips typically prefer deeper, open waters. Its extended presence in that nearshore area was unusual to begin with. Perhaps food sources shifted, or there was competition from other predators. Natural movement patterns in sharks are still not fully understood." There was an undercurrent in her voice that suggested she wasn't sharing everything. "Is there something else?" Ray pressed. After a brief hesitation, Dr. Chen continued. "There is another possibility. A commercial fishing vessel reported catching an oceanic white-tip approximately 70 miles offshore 3 weeks ago. Their description matches our tagged individual, including the crescent scar. But the tag itself was no longer attached. They released the shark as required by regulations, but reported that it appeared injured." "Injured how?" Ray asked. "They weren't specific in their report," Dr. Chen said. "But if it was our tagged individual, and it had sustained significant injuries, that could explain the change in its movement patterns. Injured sharks often alter their hunting strategies and territories temporarily." After the call ended, Ray found himself considering this information with mixed emotions. The knowledge that the specific shark that had attacked him was no longer patrolling nearby waters brought some relief. Yet there was also a strange sense of connection severed. The creature that had so dramatically altered the course of his life had moved on, carrying no awareness of the lasting impact it had left behind. 1 year after the attack, Ray stood at the stern of the Marlin Hunter, watching his client reel in a substantial mahi-mahi. His right leg ached as it always did after a full day on the water, and he shifted his weight to ease the discomfort. The scars remained vivid against his tanned skin, a permanent reminder of his encounter with the oceanic white-tip. He had gradually rebuilt his charter business, though on a more limited scale than before. Most trips stayed closer to shore than his pre-attack excursions, and he always brought a second mate for additional safety. His experience had made him more cautious, but not fearful, a distinction he considered important. Occasionally, he still had nightmares about those moments in the water, feeling teeth tear into his flesh and watching his blood cloud the crystal-clear gulf. On particularly bad nights, he would wake gasping for breath, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, but those episodes had become less frequent with time. Emily had married the previous month, with Ray walking her down the aisle using only a decorative cane for support. His pronounced limp and the visible scars on his leg had drawn curious glances from some wedding guests, but Ray had smiled through the ceremony, focusing on his daughter's happiness rather than his own discomfort. As his client successfully brought the mahi-mahi aboard, Ray spotted a fin cutting through the water about 50 yards away, a black-tip shark attracted by the fish's struggle. A year ago, such a sight might have triggered a panic attack. Now he merely noted its presence with professional interest, adjusting their fishing strategy accordingly. The oceanic white-tip that had attacked him had never returned to local waters, as far as official reports indicated. The satellite tag had ceased transmission shortly after the commercial fishing vessel's encounter with the injured shark, leaving its fate unknown. Ray sometimes wondered if it had survived its injuries, perhaps returning to the deep oceanic waters that were its natural habitat, or if it had succumbed to them, sinking to the seafloor to become part of the marine ecosystem's eternal cycle. In unguarded moments, Ray occasionally found himself scanning the water for a distinctive fin with white tips, half expecting to see the 9-foot predator materializing from the depths. But as days turned to weeks and weeks to months without any sign, he gradually accepted that their paths would likely never cross again. The shark had left its mark on him, both physically in the scars that mapped its attack across his leg, and mentally in the caution that now informed his every decision on the water. But Ray had refused to allow that single violent encounter to define him entirely or to sever his lifelong connection to the sea. As he helped his client secure the mahi-mahi in the fish box, Ray glanced at the horizon where blue water met blue, sky in a seamless line. Somewhere out there, perhaps the oceanic white-tip still swam, following its instinctive drives, unaware of the human whose life it had forever altered. Two beings whose lives had intersected briefly but dramatically, now separated by time and distance, but linked by a single day of violence neither had anticipated. Ray turned his attention back to his client, suggesting they try another spot before heading back to the marina. The marlin hunter came about smoothly under his guidance, cutting through gentle swells toward new waters as the day's light began its slow transition toward evening. Behind them, unseen beneath the surface, the black-tipped shark continued its patrol, a silent reminder of the wild forces that existed beyond human control, forces that demanded respect rather than fear, understanding rather than vengeance. Miles away in the deeper waters of the Gulf Stream, something large and streamlined moved with fluid grace through the blue darkness. Sunlight filtering from above caught the distinctive white tips of its fins as it changed course, responding to some imperceptible stimulus. The oceanic white-tip shark, bearing the crescent-shaped scar on its right side, followed ancient instincts that had served its species for millions of years before humans ever ventured onto the water. It swam onward, neither malevolent nor merciful, simply a perfect predator, fulfilling its role in the vast indifferent sea.